and then we start. Okay, we are
Okay,
recording. So let's wait a
we're
couple of minutes.
recording. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of Exocapitalism. Exocapitalism is the idea that capitalism does not belong to humans. The titular book, launched by Becoming Press at um, 25, and this accompanying sameness spring from a dissatisfaction with the sameness of Marxian critical social theory. This theoretical lineage appears to be poisoned by a Marvel Cinematic Universe approach to storytelling when it comes to economics. Capitalism is almost always a powerful, demonic, one-dimensional big bad against which the accumulated forces of dignified human laborers engage in heroic planetary-scale battle. The seminar instructors, Marek, Poliks, and Roberto Alonso Trillo, the authors of the book, pushed this starred metaphor to its breaking point. What if capitalism is so univocal as to be actually transcendental? What if it cohabits with its share of the Empyrean with things like computation and mathematics? What if capitalism can happen on anything, anywhere? We taught us. At the core of exocapitalism is the logical kernel of arbitrage, the bubbling contingents of price and value as buried exploits in simple temporal differential. Poliks and Trillo collapsed tens of thousands of years of human economic activity into this kernel, even labor, which in exocapitalism is strictly and simply the injection of manufactured volatility into a red asset. But labor itself, let alone the simple of commodity exchange, is insufficiently volatile for exocapitalism hyperfactly scalarity. It is bound to fixed cause, a predictable dependence to sustain the attention of exocapitalist flows. Instead, exocapitalism treats the entire terrestrial condition as a hyperdimensional random number generated upon which to wage and hedge controlled bets. Yet, even this is sufficient. More dimensions, more abstractions, and greater differentials appear with the greater and greater velocity. The human is left to consider what happens when this entire process and its operation mechanics leave us behind entirely. About the instructors, um, Marek Poliks is a researcher in the philosophy of technology. He's based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Marek and his primary research partner, Roberto Alonso Trillo, have been working to situate deep learning tools as endosymbiotic reproductive infrastructure in organic vehicles through which biological, epistemological, and social information is encoded, subject to contingent process, and transmitted. Marek's strategic leadership background in the tech sector affords him a distinct perspective within the philosophy space, one immersed in the material mechanics of high-scale software architecture and its financialization. Roberto Alonso Trillo research engages the aesthetic and political dimensions of machine learning, with particular attention to infrastructure and performance. In ongoing collaboration with Marek Poliks, he investigates AI theory and speculative design as part of a broader inquiry into automation and cultural production. His interdisciplinary practice is standing in sound art, post-instrumental music, and critical pedagogic. Um, I think it's that you can start.
Amazing. Thank you
Amazing.
so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Roberto,
Can we share a
just right
screen?
off
Can you
the,
share a screen?
yeah, I was trying to share a screen, but it was getting booted. Let me just try one more time.
You
My screen
can.
is sharing. Just
Is
like,
that
is it gonna go away? It
is
was
that
like
stable?
disappearing. Yeah, it felt like it was unstable. Well, maybe it's stable. Okay, maybe
Okay,
we're good.
looks fine.
Sweet. All right,
So
cool.
let's go.
Let's go.
Well,
Let's
thank
fucking
you,
go.
everyone. Thank you for being here again. What an amazing group of people. It's an honor for us, and we're really excited. And we've prepared something that hopefully you're gonna enjoy. And at the end, we can have some time to discuss some of the ideas. As we already pointed out, this course comes out of a book that we published last year called Exocapitalism with amazing Becoming Press. Some of you know Becoming, follow, read some really amazing books published over the past few years. But we are not here just to teach the book, okay? We're here to build on it with everyone, okay? So if you've read the book, great. If you haven't read the book, that's also great. We are going to build the machinery together.
So let's get started. I think most people are probably familiar with like what the general project of exocapitalism is, but let's just state it again. What we mean by exocapitalism is exactly that proposition of looking at or understanding capitalism not primarily through the social sciences, not primarily as a social arrangement or as a sociogenic thing, like a thing that is created by social forces, but actually something that we consider to be formal. And that gets a little spooky. What we mean by formal, we mean virtual, we potentially even mean transcendental. We mean something that's really complex that we'll spend quite a bit of time untangling. But let's hold it as formal at the moment. We're not talking about something social, we're talking about something formal, and we're kind of enjoying the ability to separate those two things out a little bit, at least for now. And we find it to be very useful. And moreover, the way that we allow ourselves to think of exocapitalism or capitalism as formal is because we see it as an operation that we can run as a repeatable procedure on different substrates or different kind of substances. You could do it in one place, you could do it in another place, you could run it on humans, you can run it on aliens or plants or whatever. The substrate is independent to a certain extent from the actual mechanics in play, and that's where we get really excited. And so the reason or like the interest that we have in decoupling capitalism from strictly social analysis is because like it really changes where the conversation is happening. It's not a conversation about the effects of capital. We have those conversations all the time. I have those conversations all the time. I read books that have those conversations all the time. We're all very aware of the effects that capitalism has on people, and obviously the very many different ways of that very different capitalisms have on very different people, right? There's a big constellation of that, but we're not going to talk about effects. We're going to talk about the intelligibility of capital and capitalism. We're very sloppy about capital and capitalism, but the intelligibility of these things on their own terms. And we think it's really important. And what this really lets us do is it lets us not treat capitalism as a single like bad thing, as like a giant kind of like black hole of evil. And that could be useful. Like there's all kinds of like useful ways to think about capitalism that way, but we're not going to do so very intentionally. And we're also not going to treat it as as strictly an intensification of other bad things. Like we're not going to conflate it with imperialism or colonialism, because in doing so, we not only deny, let's say, the dignity of those terms on their own respect, but we also like it's like kind of violent to do so. Like there's different kind of specific vectors to those things that are worth kind of teasing out. So yeah, we're not treating it as like a kind of black box on its own terms, and we're not treating it as strictly an intensification of other things. We're going to treat it as a procedural intelligence that can take many forms and that doesn't care about the meanings that we project onto it. And we allow ourselves to look for capitalism ultimately wherever we can find what we call a translation between worlds, wherever we can find a differential. We identify capitalism as an externality or an effect of the friction between real ontological difference that exists out there and representational order. Those two things we view as in a state of permanent contest. And that tension, the negotiation of that tension, creates a surplus of representational correctives. And the management of that surplus of representational schemes, the management of the fact that we are beings moving through space with ontologically distinct beings, that difference exists, understanding that difference exists and that our representational schema struggle with difference as such, creates the possibility that we represent different things in different ways. And in so doing, all of a sudden, markets start to transform. We start to have the necessity to translate between our experiences, and from there, things really can get out of hand in a particular way. So it's the management of the surplus of representational schemes that creates opportunities for schemas like markets, value, and what we're going to talk about today, which is arbitrage.
So, as you probably know, the seminar is structured as four separate sessions. And what we're going to be doing in these sessions is to explore one mechanic. Okay. And by mechanic here, we mean an internal tendency that we can track across different substrates, as Marek was pointing out before. So, session one, that's today. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We're going to be discussing arbitrage. We're going to be exploring how arbitrage is kind of the kernel operation of capitalism, if you want. Session two, which is next week, is going to be focusing on software economy and the idea of default. We will explore how new dimensions of relation get manufactured in software as a service, orchestration, platforms, and so on. Session three, in 2 weeks, is going to focus on two key concepts from the book, lift and drag. And we will explore how abstraction works as a corporate drive, banking economies, and the residue layer of infrastructure. And finally, the last session, which is at the end of February 28th, is going to focus on the last mile, which is another key aspect of what we discuss in the book. The idea here is to explore what happens to social reproduction when exocapital becomes too fast, too abstract, or too indifferent.
So we'll send this over. We have a link to a G Drive. I posted it in the chat, and someone else helped me by even posting a much better link in the chat. So that's where you'll find a lot of this course material. Hopefully, you also won't see us actively building the course material in real time, but that would actually be kind of cool. So maybe you'll sneak upon us editing lecture transcripts and things like that. We have a lot to talk through. We're very happy to engage in clarifying questions. We'd love the opportunity to substantiate our case first, and then talk at the end, but we'll take a little pause for questions in the middle. Reading lists, to me, generous by design, not commandments. Candidly, I'm really surprised by how when I talk to, I'm going to make an assumption that I'm speaking to what we might call non-normies. I'm talking to artists, I'm talking to critical people, I'm talking to people who are very thoughtfully engaged with the world, which more or less is an exception to the norm. But the normie verse is really important to understand. So if you can't draw an enterprise sales funnel on a piece of paper right now, I definitely try and watch some of the videos that we link in the syllabus. Like, I think it's actually really important to get a sense of what that looks like. Maybe even log into LinkedIn while you're at it. Like, that would feel like a good productive exercise. Maybe make a bet on Kalshi. These are things that are bad for the soul, but a kind of necessary micro indulgence that helps people grow. And you can also ignore the slides, like they don't really do any work apart from just kind of adding an aesthetic layer. So we actually just mostly use them as like structuring things. So Roberto, what are we doing today?
What are we doing today? So today is Act 1, which is going to focus on arbitrage, yeah? And we can understand arbitrage not simply as a financial term, but as the cleanest way to name the operation we want to follow across more than 2,400 years. In the book, we're quite explicit. The idea is that arbitrage predates capitalism, or if you want to put it differently, that arbitrage, the earliest documented arbitrage, contains the preconditions of capitalism itself. And we want to push that even further. At its core, arbitrage is about time. So the idea here is quite simple. The asset does not change. The medium does not change. But somehow value appears through the temporality of exchange. So today we're going to be extremely literal. We will not look at arbitrage as a metaphor, but actually arbitrage as a machine.
And I'm not going to spend too much time belaboring this. This is 3 sections. We'll talk about theory first. We'll spend like 20 minutes talking about what arbitrage is. So if you're unfamiliar with what arbitrage is, don't worry. We're going to really get into it. I'll feel like you'll not only understand what arbitrage is, but you'll understand arbitrage better than people who do arbitrage every day, which is, I think, a good outcome. Then we're going to go through history and look at some substantiating evidence that provides some like nice context for understanding arbitrage. And then we'll go to the present day. We'll talk about the Black-Scholes model, which is really like one of the weirdest examples of hyperstition, most substantial examples of hyperstition I can think of. Economically, hopefully you'll understand what Black-Scholes is by the end of this and why it's so crazy and why it, like, in its own kind of weird way, the permanent scar that's left on the market is like a really great piece of evidence for the book that we've put in front of you. So what is arbitrage, Roberto?
So let us try to define it as cleanly as possible. Let us start with a simple definition. Arbitrage, we are going to walk through different definitions here. We're going to fine tune the idea. But let's start simple. Arbitrage is a simultaneous purchase and sale of the same asset in different markets in order to capture price differential. Okay, so classic example would be, you look at gold trades, and 1 ounce of gold in London has a price. The same ounce of gold in New York has a different price, higher price. So you buy gold in New York, you sell it. You buy gold in London, you sell it in New York, and if the transaction costs are lower than that price differential, then you're making profit. It's quite simple. Now, the question here is that value does not emerge from gold itself. It emerges from the discrepancy between two valuation regimes that coexist without collapsing. Okay, it emerges from the gap, as we were pointing out before, between two worlds. Now, if you take a conservative position on the subject, you can say that markets hate arbitrage. In fact, you could even argue that the point of a market is to smoothen away opportunities for this kind of mispricing to exist. So, going back to the example before, gold buyers will take note of the price at a different marketplace, and demand will adjust accordingly. At the end, things will even out. In some sense, I guess, you can think of classical arbitrage as a kind of regulatory mechanism through which markets resolve their differences, right? Enough arbitrageurs exploiting mispricing will ultimately lead to price equilibration.
I lost all interfaces there for a second. I'm stop muting myself between talking. I just turned on my heaters, so that's why I keep doing it. But whatever. Hopefully you get the sense of like what's going on, right? Like if you buy gold that's cheaper in one place and more expensive and sell it in a place that's more expensive, you make a profit on it. So long as it's still makes sense in terms of cost to move that gold around, or the costs of selling that gold don't exceed that differential. And the question that we're asking is like, where does that value come from? Like, what is the thing that produces that value? And we want to look at that as like a kind of atomic kernel for how value is ultimately produced under mercantilism and ultimately capitalism. And like the more extreme versions of arbitrage are high frequency trading, algorithmic trading, which make up the vast majority of transactions that occur today by volume across all markets at scale. You have, large institutions that are making many, many, many thousands of trades per second. We're working at the millisecond level here, sometimes even faster, though it's really just bound to like the speed of compute and the speed of communication to the market and the speed of the ledger of the market. And so like if you're able to make these unbelievably high frequency trades where let's say you're just basically betting on a statistical curve and guessing that this curve might be worth more in this particular position than it is in this particular position between two markets, you're able to engage in this practice. And this is the kind of most pure form of arbitrage, because you're literally engaged in purely computational assessments of contextual mispricing and just taking advantage of those assessments. That's it. Like you're using a computer to get a sense that some asset is worth more in one place than it is in another, and just taking advantage of it purely. You don't know what it is. You don't care what it is. That thing, that underlying thing. And so this is where we'll get a little theoretical. So we love Suhail Malik. I think the Ontology of Finance is probably my favorite piece of writing about economics. Incredibly, incredibly important to us. And a major allegation that he makes in that piece, which we take for granted, is the ontological primacy of price. So if you think about what's actually going on, it's an operation that exploits the fact that prices are not mere reflections of value, but actual governing relations of value. Value you can think of is the worthness of something, right? How much is something worth? And price is the kind of strike position of how much it actually costs. A price is a decision. It's an ordering of the world. And Suhail argues that price as such and value after it are constituted by and instantiated as differentials wherever and however spontaneously they happen. And so let's go through the kind of standard Marxian understanding of this. Also standard, classical economic understanding as well, which is that price represents something else. For most people, most kind of conventional economic analysis, price is the signifier and value is the signified. There's like a quantum of worth that exists prior to and independent of pricing in the form of value. Whether you locate that worth in labor time, in utility, in scarcity, in marginal productivity, there's a sense that value exists. Value is real, and pricing comes downstream of value. Price arrives as a more or less accurate reflection of that prior reality in value. And so mispricing is therefore an error. And arbitrage is the correction of an error. It's an error because the price does not accurately represent the value, right? And so then markets, you can expect, would tend towards a kind of equilibrium where prices are going to finally match the value that they were always trying to represent. There is some objective but locally determined value of a thing. And if something is priced incorrectly, we'll get to a correct pricing of that thing through this kind of arbitrage mechanism. But so we disagree with this. That's the conventional understanding that you have value, that something is worth something more or less objectively, and then price is this kind of limiting negotiation that finally converges on what that value is. But we disagree through Suhail Malik. Price doesn't represent value. Price constitutes value. Price is the generative act of value. There is no such thing as an objective value waiting to be accurately priced. It's the pricing operation itself, which is where value comes into existence. Value is just what happens for us when pricing happens. So hopefully you understand like the extremeness of what we're suggesting here, that things aren't worth anything. Things aren't worth anything of their own terms. Things receive the amount that they are worth when they are priced, when a price is given to them. And this is an important, we'll tease this out.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. So going back to the previous definition of arbitrage, from this perspective, we can reframe arbitrage or fine-tune that definition by arguing that arbitrage is the extraction of value from any differential. And that could be spatial, temporal, informational, or computational between two or more price regimes. So again, we're going back to the same ideas over and over. We're going to discuss this quite a few times over the next couple of hours, hour and a half. The idea is quite simple. The asset remains stable across these regimes. What changes is the system through which it is priced, cleared, and rendered actionable. So this is key. Arbitrage exploits the ungroundedness of these systems. Okay, that's a key concept. Now, if we think about arbitrage, the mechanics of arbitrage require only 4 key conditions. That's the way we're approaching it. The first one would be temporal delay, and that's a separation between purchase and sale. The delay may be long or within the dimensionality of machinic immediacy, but it does introduce an interval in which valuation remains unresolved. And time here is not neutral. Yeah, it is the medium through which discrepancy persists. The second condition is price differential. So the same asset appears under different prices across markets, locations, or representational systems. And we could even expand this, if you want, this differential span to time, right? Why not? The third condition would be what we call reversibility, which is the capacity to move between regimes and complete the circuit. So arbitrage on this regard depends on round-trip passage, whether through transport, accounting infrastructures, or automated execution. And the final condition is what we also call abstract exchangeability, the idea that an asset can be represented in fungible units and thus rendered commensurable across different contexts. What this presupposes is representational systems that are capable of translating heterogeneous situations into comparable units. So these are the kind of 4 key conditions that make arbitrage possible. Now, within this operation, as we were pointing out, the object remains unchanged. What generates value is the persistence of abstracted difference across price regimes. And again, if we want to go back to Malik's terms, as Marek was pointing out before, this difference is not accidental. It is constitutive of how financial reality is organized. Arbitrage treats discrepancy as a governing condition rather than a problem that has to be resolved.
And maybe it's worth like kind of doubling down on what Roberto is saying when he says that the asset remains unchanged. Like the gold doesn't change, right? If you're trading gold based on the simple price of gold in one market versus another, the gold isn't transforming. No labor is applied to the gold. There's no factories or wage relations or modes of production that are mobilized towards the transformation of that gold in some sense. The type of exploitation here is just opportunism. So yeah, it's a correction of a mistake. The gold is irrelevant. The mistake exists at the level of the ledger, of the accounting infrastructure that's used to understand that this gold costs this much in this location and this much in this location. The operation is fungible. You can do it on gold. You can do it on silver. You can do it on plutonium. You can do it on ETFs, crypto, meme coins, whatever. It really doesn't matter. That's the point. And so you can think of arbitrage or any transaction as a kind of graph with three states. And like you can see the states here. You have the entry, you have the hold, and then you have the sale. So buy, hold, sell, right? And you can see that they're taking long positions and short positions accordingly. So what they're betting whether or not a stock is going to go up or go down. Doesn't matter whether or not the line goes up or down. What matters is that the line moves in the direction of the bet that you made. And so if you think about this broken down into buy, hold, and sell as a kind of fundamental economic kernel, the buy and the sale of some asset, it doesn't matter what the asset is, they perform this kind of translation work between regimes. They recursively contain each other. Every sale is another buy action by another actor, right? It's this chain. But the hold is the kind of important bit. That's where the differential is sustained and where price, as you can see here, is modulated. But again, the asset doesn't change. It doesn't need to change. The transformation is just occurring at the level of the ledger. Whoops. And if you're thinking about what happens during a hold phase after you purchase some asset and that value changes, it could be materially grounded. Obviously, like a company like Amazon might return a strong earnings report, and the value of a shareholder's asset, their ownership of Amazon stock, would increase. And there's already a kind of interesting dematerialization there. It's like not that Amazon's revenue made you money. It's not the fact that Amazon made more money that's making you more money. It's rather a report that Amazon's revenue increased that therefore made you money, right? It's like this weird, already a kind of initial level of abstraction. And you can also keep it super material. Like you can buy raw materials, turn them into jewelry, and sell those materials. Like that would be an even more kind of materially grounded case. But you can also get more abstract, like an ETF, for example. I don't know who here trades ETFs. I can probably I'll look at like the hairline of people here, and like the more your hairline looks like mine, the more likely it is you're in the ETF trading game. But I mean, an ETF is basically a bundle of assets, and like like you kind of don't know what they are. You know, they're a name for a bundle of assets that's ultimately being managed by somebody else. And you're essentially placing a bet on a historical account of movements. Like this is a real kind of powerful divorce from what's ultimately like you don't know if Amazon necessarily is contained within that thing. Of course you might, but the sense is that you're taking a bet on a kind of bundle. And so the abstract value of those returns, it's pretty wild. Like there's a meaningful divorce between what a company does and the result from your portfolio. It gets more and more abstract. So value is accruing in this very kind of abstract sense. And if you're doing this, if you look at the time axis here, if you're doing this like several times per second, it doesn't make sense to say like, okay, Amazon's action at this particular second generated value for me as a shareholder. It also doesn't make sense. I mean, like you're literally just betting on math. You're betting on the mathematical property of a curve. You're not actually betting on any kind of transformation of the underlying asset, but rather its movement towards time, through time.
So, as Mark expands, I'm going to try to compress this into simple sequence and then let him take it from there. And from the book, we have this idea, this axiomatic of capitalism, which is that sequence of buy, hold, sell that is repeated ad infinitum. An important thing here is that translation happens during buy and sell, and value production happens during a hold. So, key idea, translation, buy and sell mark those moments of translation. And that's where each operation situates the asset within a valuation regime, fixes a price, and clears an equivalence.
So I'm gonna get like even crazier here. So if you follow a traditional history of capitalism, you understand the corrective impulse of a market against something like arbitrage as a correction made in the service of efficiency. Like if a thing is more expensive in one location than in another, obviously demand will increase against the cheaper location until you get price equilibrium. But because value is produced through the opportunistic exploitation of inefficiencies, you can then invert the statement to say that it is precisely inefficiency itself that is productive of value, and that it creates opportunities for the new articulation of price. And moreover, you can then argue that it is the market contexts that are the most plagued with inefficiencies that are the most productive. The more complex the ledger, the more opaque the communicational layer between market actors, the more opportunities there are for arbitrage to exploit price differentials and therefore produce value. If you think about, like, for example, the amount of value produced and lost and exchanged through higher order options trading, derivatives, futures, or even crypto, like it's obviously enormous because there's so much complexity, there's so much possibility for spontaneous value generation simply through the translation of these media against each other. So the rougher the market is, the more surface area it has, the more relations it contains, the more topologically complex it is, the more possible it is for the representational matrix of price to contain exploitable redundancies. So that's a claim. It seems not only possible, but reasonable to think about arbitrage as productive, in that you are literally producing opportunities for value to be created. The productive operation is only productive insofar as it has inefficiencies it can exploit, meaning that there exist problems, mispricings, translation difficulties, frictions that can be exploited to say that gold is more expensive here than it is here. And then the productive operation is productive at the level of the differential, at the level of price. And it is productive within its own terms. It's not the exploitation of any external productivity. It's not the exploitation of something like labor, conventionally defined. It's the exploitation of something more abstract. And so this is where we're going to get really, really crazy. Because when you think about production under capitalism, you think about a chain of events that cascades from use value into surplus value. Like a worker will apply labor to a commodity. That commodity is going to transform in some way. You'll take some raw materials that'll transform into commodity through labor. And that transformation through labor is where value is added, right, in the Marxian account. And then the difference between the value produced by that laborer and the wage paid to them is then appropriated by the capitalist. So that's the archetypal transformation you get from Marx is M, C, M prime, basically money, commodity, and then something like more money, which represents the differential between the value of the original capital investment, M, and that value which is ultimately extracted from the constructed form of that investment. And because that differential is positive, because you have more value at the end, at the M prime layer, and because the construction and the packaging of that original M into a commodity was done by labor, because labor was the reason that M prime is greater than M, then Marx would argue that labor has therefore a moral claim to the value of that differential, right? They produce the value, they should receive the share of that value. But because the capitalist class refuses the return of that differential to labor and instead reinvests that differential, that prime, back into capital, the capitalist class is able to produce more capital from capital through this exchange. And that assessment of productivity can be strictly circumscribed to the surplus value claimed by that capitalist. And so here's something that we find really interesting about Marx, which is that there's a kind of homeostasis to value. It suggests that all value here, all value constructed, is constrained or contained by the exchange. The surplus value here simply results from the additive function of labor, the transformation of some kind of capital into a commodity in the form of labor time. And then from the monopoly of force that capital can leverage to remove this value from the hands of labor. So that's how surplus value is ultimately generated within the system. Emerson, can we take your question in 5 minutes, or is it urgent?
It,
I just wanted to ask if you guys could try really hard when you're switching between like this is how we usually think of it, blah 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 blah. Like this is what's actually going on. Like I'm getting lost in the sauce there a little bit.
Got it, got it, got it. Okay.
Okay.
So the way that we're describing this is the conventional account. Like the conventional account is that you have money, you have labor that's applied to that money to transform resources to transform capital as such, which could be resources or money, into more resources. And then the differential, the value that's created by the labor in the middle, that's the surplus value that's then expropriated by the capitalist and not returned justly back to the laborer, right? That's the conventional architecture here. That's the one that we're going to critique. And Roberto's going to do that right now.
Yeah, so I'll try to make it as clear as possible. So starting from there, our proposition is quite different. Yes, to us, the C, that midpoint in the M to C to M prime equation that we just discussed, is just one way through which M makes more of itself. And of course, Marx kind of knew this as well. But the key difference here is that for Marx, value is always conserved. Any reading of what Marx calls merchant capital is decomposable in his analysis into the parasitic redistribution of value produced by labor. The idea is that labor is just hidden. Okay, it's still there, but it's not visible anymore. But there is no homeostasis in our system. Value does not need to be conserved. It can be freely constructed given the available complexity of a market through the mechanism of arbitrage. So this is a key difference here. We're moving from that original M to C to M prime into an equation that will end up removing the C in the midpoint. And we're trying to look at the mechanics that underpin how can be explained and how it's actually happening, okay? So the idea is that as far as you have volatility within a market, as far as the market moves, there are instruments that can transform volatility into value. Volatility is one of the key concepts we're going to be discussing today. Now, labor then gets put into a weird box. Okay, labor it's a key driving concept for Marxian critique. But if you take Marx literally, and you argue that capital can be decomposed into labor and labor time, then you can argue a few things. Okay, you can argue that buying and holding an asset is a kind of labor, which means that the capitalist class is engaged in a type of labor that correlates in value production directly to that of either aggregate labor value or, if you want to be less generous, surplus value extraction. Okay, but you could also argue something else, which to us is much more interesting, is that market volatility in itself is a form of labor. Or rather, if you want to put it differently, that labor can be decomposable to the production of volatility. Now, the second argument to us is more interesting because if we want to understand buy, hold, sell as M to C to M prime, and we agree that value is generated during the hold phase through volatility, then market movement itself becomes labor. Volatility becomes a productive force. It becomes the labor of the market.
Emerson, I'm going to break this down super clear. I'm actually going to go back to this diagram right here. I'm going to ask what is the way to think about labor in this particular dynamic? And one thing that you could say is that, let's say I'm going to take a long position here. So I'm going to take a conventional bet that this number is going to increase over time, and I'm going to make money by trading at these particular points. And in so doing, like that, this is going to be real, like actual value will be delivered back to me. And if I think about this in conventional labor dynamics, there's like two interesting ways that you can think about this problem. The first being that my willingness to buy and sell and the tools that I use to make this assessment are labor. So me as a capitalist making decisions around buying and selling assets is a kind of labor. That would be one way that you could think about it. And I think that's cool and interesting. And that's probably the kind of easiest way to think about it. But what I'd like to actually propose is that it's all the stuff that makes this thing wiggle in the middle that is labor. The labor, the reason that this thing is, the reason that I'm able to actually kind of extract value from this system is that this line is moving. And the movement of that line is decomposable into all kinds of like weird, abstract, arbitrary decisions that we can never really kind of fully understand. And so what I'd like to suggest is that this is the labor of the market, which is generating volatility. Volatility meaning simply how widely and quickly this graph swings. So volatility is like, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. Some stocks are pretty consistent. Some stocks wiggle around a lot. The more volatility there is, the more opportunities there are for me to make these temporal decisions to buy and sell. And the actual the extraction that I get of price within this differential, the value that's returned from those pricing decisions, is something that flows downstream from what I could say is the labor of the market itself. So hopefully that's clear. I'm gonna move on to an even more insane argument, which is that if you think about this exchange right here as something like what Hugh posted in the chat, like the 20 yards of linen to one coat transformation. So like MCM would be 20 yards of linen transformed into a coat, sold at a value, right? Sold at some kind of value differential, right? So the yeah, I'll go here. So if you think about all transformations, all production of value through MCM prime, like for example within industrial capitalism, you can understand that less as the production of value in the commodity phase through building things, but rather the production of volatility through which purchases that are made by capital confront a differential in price. So the kind of cloth example is that like linen or cotton has a price and cloth or a coat has a different price. And so what the mill is doing that is ultimately producing coats is not adding value per se. It's instead producing a kind of categorical differential between two different price regimes, the regime of cotton or linen and the regime of coats. They're different entries on different ledgers. And what the mill is doing through labor is translating across the gap between them. And surplus value is going to emerge from exposure to indeterminacy itself, from managing the interval where outcomes remain undecidable. So it's not through the production of coats, but rather through the mediation of two different markets that value is produced. That's how we're kind of looking to industrial capitalism. We're trying to make a connection to that and the types of decisions that we see made, millions of times a second on the stock market. And the mill produces a kind of temporal volatility because while cotton prices are fluctuating, coat prices are also fluctuating, and those fluctuations aren't synchronized. So by holding inventory at various stages of production, the mill operator is constantly positioned as across different asynchronous price movements. And in this reading, labor is not adding value, but labor is producing the conditions under which prices differ, that between linen and coats. And from this perspective, labor remains operative as one possible way of introducing volatility into a system, one technique among others for generating spread, variety, differential. And at lower levels of abstraction, commodities, you might need something like labor to manufacture that differential because its instrumentation isn't super sophisticated. But at higher levels, derivatives, meme coins, the instrumentation is much, much less expensive and much more high control. And we'll return to that point when we say that capitalism lifts.
So I think everything will become clearer as we advance through the lecture today. So one of the key ideas that we're trying to present here is that arbitrage, as we pointed out, predates capitalism by a long stretch. Now, if you take our formal definition of arbitrage seriously, then you can argue first that all market operations can be understood as a form of arbitrage. That's fundamental. And second, that arbitrage has consequently been around as long as markets, as long as money, and further still, since the first plane of abstract equivalence was drawn to mediate the exchange value of different things through a new third thing. Now, we're going to dig into some case studies now. If there are any other questions, maybe we can take them now. But if not, we will be happy and more than happy to kind of complete the argument. And when we finish, we can open a discussion if you want. So unless someone has a pressing question, we're going to keep moving, if that's okay. Is everyone happy with that? Yeah? Okay. So our first case study, our first case, we're going to go back to 5th century BC, to the Achaemenid Persia. Now, the Achaemenid Empire's monetary system that was established under Darius I around 515 BCE was history's first systematic so-called bimetallic standard. Bimetallic standard. So the Persians of this era literally engineered the monetary architecture so as to exploit metal price differentials as an instrument of imperial fiscal extraction and arbitrage. It's quite interesting that Darius's monetary system replaced an earlier Lydian coinage system with what's called this bimetallic approach. Yes, and the idea of a bimetallic approach, bimetallic system, is a monetary system with an artificially fixed gold to silver weight ratio. In this case, of around 1 to 13, which would lead at the time to a 1 to 20 coin ratio because, of course, of the density differentials. Now, by maintaining an official 13:1 gold to silver ratio that frequently diverged from market rates across their vast domain, while at the same time operating within Babylonia's entrenched whale silver economy, the Persians created what economic historian Michael Jursa calls a felicitous combination of monetary standards, which generated huge arbitrage opportunities.
So, I mean, we're talking about like currency speculation in 5th century BCE, right? Like that's like just trying to like provide some context for like how extreme this is. Like people are already speculating about the respective values of currency. And like the thing that's kind of important about this is that the imperial center basically said, we're going to fix a rate of gold to silver at 13:1. And like our empire, which you can see is like fucking huge, we don't really care that the local markets are going to diverge from that fixed rate based on local supply. You might have more kind of gold in one region, one more silver in another region, and that'll create all of these kinds of like weird differentials where in some place it'll be sold at 12.5:1, in other places it'll be sold at 10:1. And because the empire basically said, we're going to declare this for all kind of imperial transactions as that fixed 13:1 ratio, then it creates all this kind of craziness because in one place you have all these people buying gold, moving it around, transforming it into silver, in other locations, moving it around. It creates all of these opportunities for a market that's based on absolutely nothing apart from the fact that the empire said that this is the respective exchange value between these two things that created this whole kind of economy. And this actually seems like a very intentional tactic on the part of the Persian state because they're able to hoard tribute in treasuries and restrict circulation accordingly. And then the crown could manipulate the effective ratio between gold and silver based on, their vast reserves of unminted metal. And the royal monopoly on gold coinage, which they enforced by the death penalty, ensured that the king could directly profit from deploying gold at favorable moments. So it's a form of extraction in a lot of senses. Like this is what Malik means by the ontological primacy of price. Like the 13:1 ratio isn't based in anything. It doesn't represent any kind of fundamental truth about the real value of anything. That value is arbitrary. That value is a decision made by a person or a committee. And in the enforcement of that ratio, all of a sudden, you have all of these opportunities to create power dynamics, to create markets, to create different opportunities where you're just trading the respective values of metals. You're moving them around. You're creating all kinds of weird contracts in order to basically kind of deal with the fact that 13:1 ratio sponsored by the king doesn't make sense. It doesn't exist. It is insufficiently granular to confront the reality of conditions on the ground. And that for us is the beginning of all of this stuff.
So, I mean, we're looking here at a huge empire, and of course that created all kinds of opportunities for new differentials. So, for example, the Western provinces ran on coins, and the Eastern heartland ran on weight bullion. The Darik's weight was calibrated to convert cleanly into Babylonian shekels. So one Darik was 1/60th of a light mina, the weight on the slide, so that the payments assessed in one system could be discharged in another. But because the payment types were not directly commensurable, every translation required intermediaries, and every intermediary captured some margin. And eventually, families like the Murashu positioned themselves at these interfaces. Yeah, we're now focusing on the idea of this intermediation on the translation processes. And families like the Murashu became kind of large-scale credit providers. They became tax farmers. They became landlords that would capture spreads created by the empire's fragmented monetary architecture. Now, the interesting thing to us here is that the Murashu did not produce anything. in a kind of traditional sense. They will just manage translation managers. They generated profits through several different mechanisms. These kinds of financial services like arbitrage, interest rate spreads on silver loans, but also rental markups from subletting leased land, tax framing commissions, and arbitraging commodity price differentials between old barley and new barley across seasons. So the key idea here is that this figure that the kind of Murasu families came to represent is a positioning on an interface in the spaces of translation that captures the value that is generated on those intermediary kind of processes.
Exactly. And there were intermediaries in Greece too. There's the Trapezitai bankers who charged fees on currency exchanges, and currency exchanges were happening constantly. There's also the Argyra Moiboi. I have to look at how that's actually translated, but I like Moiboi, the silver changers who are basically using touchstones like this to validate the purity of coins. And what this did was it created another kind of secondary market where you might have two coins that look the same and they have the same face value, like they're worth the same in terms of what they declare on top of them, but they also are worth different amounts because one of these coins might be uglier, it might be made less substantially out of gold or silver, it may have defects and so the assayer, who's this Argyromoiboy, I need an actual Greek person to translate this, but what they basically do is they would rub the coins on a touchstone like this and see whether or not the coin was pure. And then they would create like a secondary market where they could say hey, you bring me your coins. I'll tell you that 20 of those coins are worth less than you think they are. And I'll offer you 80 good coins for your 100. I can then kind of sort those debased coins and I can then melt them and I can pass them to someone with less information than me. That's just pure arbitrage. This is a totally secondary market, not just for the coins themselves, but for how the coins look and how they're actually constitutive of the materials themselves.
And of course, the question Marx would ask here is, where does the surplus actually come from? So if the Murasu are not producing anything, if the Trapezitai are just exchanging equivalents, then the profits must be extracted from productive labor happening elsewhere, somewhere else in the system. It could be the farmers growing barley. It could be the miners extracting silver. It could be the artisans making goods. And the money changers cut then is just a slice of surplus created by that labor. We've discussed this before, yes? Now, we have a counter question here. What if the differential itself is productive? What if the gap between the 13-to-1 and 10-to-1, between assessed value and discharge value, between face value and purity, what if that gap doesn't redistribute prior value, but generates new value through its very existence? Now, we argue that the evidence from Persia raises this question, or it does not settle it, but it suggests that the operation we are tracking, going back to the of arbitrage, is very old. It suggests that this operation is somewhat metastable, and very importantly, that the operation is indifferent to whether anyone is adding labor to commodities anywhere in the circuit.
So again, they literally created an entire economy just by naming a ratio. All of that value is produced simply through the articulation and the enforcement of that ratio. It's so crazy. The same happened in the Song Dynasty in 11th century China, and actually in subsequent dynasties in China that also kind of struggled with paper money. So this is the first kind of real paper money that we saw globally, and it was a direct response to the incredible inconvenience of the iron coins that you see here. There was already a kind of segregation to Sichuan, where a lot of the iron was coming from the empire's core copper coin circulation. And what that did was it created this kind of iron money zone where you could even say a bolt of silk gauze, a bolt of silk required you to carry 83 kilograms of iron in order to exchange for it, because it was just such a weird disparity in value between iron and copper, and because in Sichuan iron was so undervalued. And so at a certain point, they needed to declare the same kind of ratio between iron coins and copper coins in the Song Dynasty, but it became very, very difficult to actually enforce that. And by 993, merchants were exchanging 10 iron coins per one copper coin, which created this like crazy differential between official and market rates, all kinds of complexity happening there. And so paper money basically emerged from a correction to actually sort of neutralize all of this auxiliary speculation and to actually kind of say here, like I will actually name what price looks like. I will name price's relationship to value by producing a piece of paper that is maybe backed by copper, but is ultimately just in and of itself a representation. But the paper had two types of value. It had face value, which is what was actually written on the paper, but it also had market value, which was always fluctuating. And the real problem is that the Southern Song dynasty operated 4 separate currency zones with different paper currencies and different metal standards. So in southeastern metropolitan China, there was one type of paper currency that was denominated in copper. In Sichuan, there was another paper currency that was backed by iron. In Huinan, in the border zone, there was another paper currency, like a different paper currency backed by iron. And then in the Jinghu region, there was another paper currency that was literally just defined as a buffer against any other kind of currency overflow. So it's like crazy. It's the most fragmented monetary system that had like ever occurred. You had 4 different types of paper money backed by different things operating within an empire. Huge efficiency mess. But from our standpoint, that fragmentation was really productive, because every boundary between all of those zones is an interface, and every interface requires translation. Every translation generates margin. So the rougher the monetary landscape, the more surface area there exists for arbitrage. And you can think of this as like analogous to something more like crypto to a certain extent, in that you have like all of these different semi-official and official denominations that are competing with each other, that are rapidly increasing and decreasing in value, just cascading all over the place and flowing around. So there was a couple different types of arbitrage that were happening. There was the differential between copper and iron, where the official rate was fixing 2 iron coins to 1 copper coin, but the trade rate, like in various parts of the country, had up to like a 500% premium for copper based on local availability of copper. So people were just transporting copper around from iron zones to copper zones, or converting iron earnings into copper for interregional trade. That was one thing. Silver was another principal conduit for this. So it was like this kind of intermediary currency between copper and iron, and that rate of silver to copper and iron was always changing. Then you also have the type of arbitrage between the paper money's face value and its actual market value, which was creating all kinds of problems. The governments would mandate paper acceptance as at face value for tax payments. So like when you're paying your taxes, you pay it in paper money, and that face value that's written on the currency itself was honored by the government. So for taxes, for any kind of purchases of any monopoly goods, you'd have to buy contracts to buy things like salt, tea, garlic, stuff like that. And for military payments. So you have this like on one side of the house, you're paying your taxes based on like if you have a $20 bill, you're paying your taxes with that $20 bill. That's like how like I owe the government $20, I'm going to pay them $20 with a $20 bill. But market rates fluctuated wildly between total circulation and redemption confidence. And so like you have places where the actual kind of face value versus the market value of paper currency is like 60 to 90% off. So you have merchants that are picking up like, paper here, trading it on its entirely different kind of currency scale. You go with, let's say you go buy food in one particular market and you're paying a completely different relationship to how you would buy food than you would pay taxes with the government. That creates all kinds of complexity. You also have secondary markets where the quality of the paper itself correlates directly to how much it's worth. So like a crumpled $20 bill is worth less than like a really nice $20 bill. I mean, this like all kinds of this complexity just like thriving within this scene.
And so what we get is intermediaries, like we've discussed in the case of Persia and also Greece. Yeah. So they were called the Yao Yinpu exchange dealers, and they emerged as kind of critical intermediaries in this multi-currency environment. As Mark was pointing out, the complexity of the system allowed for a huge amount of arbitrage possibilities. And the idea with these exchange dealers is that provided secondary markets for salt and tea certificates that were called Yaojin, profiting from discounts on oversupply licenses that were awaiting redemption. A merchant supplying provisions to like frontier garrisons received salt certificates that were redeemable in distant salt producing regions. Exchange dealers bought these at a discount. They held them until redemption conditions improved, and then they would capture the spread. Yes. So both salt and tea licenses themselves became negotiable monetary instruments functioning like bills of exchange. Finance Commissioner Sen Kuo noted in the year 1077 that salt licenses were held by the rich as savings. Chancellor Kai Jing formalized this in the year 1113 through a salt license system that created paper instruments that traded on secondary markets alongside paper currencies, such as the ones Marek was discussing before, that were called yachts and huts. I've been practicing the pronunciation today with some colleagues here. Now, that is, the wealthy accumulated these licenses, speculating on future redemption values, a form of government debt, if you want, trading. It's, centuries before European sovereign bond markets. Money changers facilitated essential conversions across this multi-currency environment, not only translating across markets, but also creating new markets, okay? Like markets for worn, for expired, and for depreciated notes. New issue wheats, these currencies, paper currencies, received premiums over old notes, as Mike was pointing out before, and full weight coins traded above debased coins. Of course, silver transactions required experienced money handlers for purity assessment and weighting. Every monetary interface here, and we're thinking paper to metal, copper to iron, new to old, official to market, generated exchange fees. Typically, we are thinking here of a 3% paper to con conversion and up to a 10% for flying cash, for long distance remittance. But then, and this is important, the song paper collapsed. By the year 1107, yachts, one of these paper currencies, traded at 10% of face value. The replacement currency fell to 10% within a year. When the yuan conquered, they exchanged wheats at 50 to 1, and their paper currency was at the end fully debased. Now, the differential face value and market value generated huge arbitrage opportunity, but only so long as face value retained some credibility. When the Song dynasty overprinted paper money, they destabilized the face value at a rate faster than the destabilization could be traded against. And the differential disappeared, not because it was actually corrected, but because one side of this equation ceased to exist.
God, always the mute button. Okay. So the final example here before we kind of move to stage things in our conclusion is the cowrie shell trade. I don't know how familiar you guys are with the cowrie shell trade, but it's like one of the most extreme economies I can possibly imagine, which happened for millennia. And I think that the one that I'm really interested in is the trade between the Maldives and the West African markets. And so like essentially, this is a trade based on shells. So you would have like Maldivian harvesters collecting thousands of shells per person per day. I think I saw an estimate of like 12,000 shells. Imagine like going and collecting 12,000 shells a day. Crazy. I can't even imagine. So be timed towards to certain lunar cycles when like the tides are particularly advantageous. I guess certain kind of reproductive patterns of the cowries. And they process them by burying them underground for a very long time until all organic matter decayed. And then they would retrieve the shells. They'd wrap 12,000 of them at a time, 25 pounds of shells in these coconut leaves, these bundles called kotas. And then they would export them by the hundreds of tons to Bengal in exchange for rice. And then you'd have this massive proliferation of those shells outwards. And so there would be all kinds of arbitrage built on this, because obviously the value of a cowrie is based on a whole bunch of like totally random arbitrary factors. The first is like how many cowries are available, how many cowries are moving to this particular location. So in Bengal, for example, you'd have one particular rate of cowries to rupees. And so like this is like it's cool. Like you have an actual currency chart here where you see rupees next to shells and like a relatively fixed exchange rate that tends to change over time in one particular economy. In the West African coast, and this is where things get incredibly dark and dramatic, cowries were literally exchanged for enslaved persons and later palm oil. And so there would be this interior to coast travel, which created all kinds of dramatic arbitrage opportunities where you'd have, shells that are moving from the east to the west coast of Africa through the interior, where in the interior itself, during the 1710s, you'd be selling enslaved persons for 40,000 to 50,000 cowries per person. So you're selling people in terms of shells, which is at one particular value. And then by the time you get to the coast, it's a significant multiple of that, where you're buying essentially again an enslaved human person for between 160,000 to 176,000 cowries per person. Obviously execrable by every respect, but this is an economy that is essentially kind of founded on the idea that you can create some kind of rate between shells and of course enslaved human peoples, and that value is going to change dramatically based on where in Africa you're ultimately making this transaction because of the trade of cowries moving from East to West Africa. And moreover, all cowrie shells aren't created equal. So West Africans traditionally preferred the Cyprea moneta, which is these kinds of small ones over here, which are small shells with pale coloration. And the Cyprea annulus from East Africa over here was distinguished by it looks a little different. It kind of looks like an inversion of the other of them, but it was considered to be a kind of inferior currency. And then you'd also have all kinds of like currency gradients. So like, for example, you could sell moneta at different prices than annuluses. If they were shattered in some way or if they were discolored, they'd be worth a little bit less. Like you have all of these different ways to like think about a secondary market for different types of shell currency.
And I mean, one of the interesting things here is that this was all kind of linked to weather conditions, if you want, and to the monsoon cycle, because that kind of constrained Maldives-Bengal shipping to predictable windows. Yeah, you had departures during August to September, which is the southwest monsoon, and then returns December to January, northeast, sorry, monsoon. Um, and European traders noted that, for example, prices at Balasore upon cowrie ship arrival running 2 pound to per rupee lower than normal, with prices at Huli at a higher rate than Balasore, and this would create geographic temporal arbitrage for merchants who could purchase the cowries at arrival and then transport them upstream. And what we find interesting here, poetic and tragic at the same time, is this idea of the monsoon as labor, the weather as labor.
Because the weather is the thing that's creating that differential that's then being exploited, right? And when the monsoon happens, when the tide is at a certain position, when the weather is sufficiently affording of travel, prices vary wildly and new values constructed. So I want to talk about unequal exchange. So here, Emerson, I'm gonna present the Marxian case here, and then we'll invert it. But unequal exchange is like a very common idea in kind of contemporary critical theory, especially of like colonial relationships, where there's obviously a problem that you have a European trader who's profiting because they possess information, naval capacity, monopoly contracts that, let's say, the Maldivian cowrie harvester or the West African shell buyer is ultimately lacking, right? And it's a moral critique. And the idea here being that all exchange should be equal and that any inequality is a distortion introduced by asymmetric power. So the critique assumes that there does exist an equal exchange that an unequal exchange deviates from, that there is some fair price, that there is a baseline of reciprocity that's being distorted by the fact that Europeans have these ships and guns and capital that they can move around. But if price is ontologically primary, if price does not represent some underlying true value, but instead constitutes value through the very naming of price, then there's no baseline of equal exchange that unequal exchange deviates from. There's no asymmetry isn't a distortion of pricing. Asymmetry is how pricing works. the differential between what Europeans pay in Bengal and receive in Guinea isn't a deviation from what the shells are really worth. The shells really aren't worth anything prior to that pricing operation.
And you know, this is a darker conclusion than Marx's, and I think we should sit with it. So just to kind of restate what Mark was pointing out, for Marx, unequal exchange is exploitation that could be theoretically addressed through political transformation. You know, that's a kind of commonplace. If we were to remove the monopolies, equalize the information, abolish coercion, then trade could become truly reciprocal. But if price is constitutive rather than representative, there is no reciprocity to recover. The inequality is not masking a deeper equality because the inequality is generative per se. And this is what we mean when we say roughness of surface area. These two concepts are so important. And when we claim that they are productive, the monopolies, information asymmetries, and geographic barriers are not bugs to be corrected. They're categorically the generative conditions of value. Now, this doesn't make, of course, the whole cowrie trade less horrific. It makes it even more terrific and more horrific, even darker if you want. The operation that financed the slave trade was not a deviation from how markets should work. It was how markets work, operating at the scale of civilizations. This is the same structural logic that positions the Murashu that we discussed before in the case of Persia at the interface of coined and weighed silver, the positions in the case of China of the Yaojin pool between face value and market value, and the logic that positions European traders between Maldivian harvests and West African demand. We're changing the substrate, but the operation persists. And the operation is indifferent, catastrophically, inherently indifferent to whether what moves through it is barley, paper, cells, or human beings. Okay, now, up to this point, we're going to turn into the final part of the presentation now. We're getting there. Arbitrage has operated on differentials that pre-exist the structure. Okay, pre-existing differentials. I think that's clear to everyone. The interface is capturing a gap that exists. But what happens when we zoom forward into the present and look at the systematic production of differentials, where we have a model that creates the very differential that it is trying to exploit?
So we're gonna talk about Black-Scholes, and you don't have to understand this graph at all, but like it's worth reading the explanation here. So this is basically like, how do you price the value of something that you buy, of an option or a stock or an asset? And this is like a very good way to do it. This is like the various kind of variables that you need in order to plug it in, but I have my kind of translation of this down here. And like this is how you ultimately price a stock, how you make a good decision around price around stock. And this is the Black-Scholes options pricing model. And it's crazy. Like this story is crazy. Like it's really, really crazy. So this is how people make general decisions around stock prices now. And this is actually really generative in the same way that we're talking about with how Sohail Malik describes price being generative. So when the Chicago Board Options Exchange, opened in 1973, which was exactly when Black-Scholes was mainstream. So someone, Black and Scholes invented this equation, studied it, did some publications about it. There was a lot of interest in it. And then at the time of the release, at the time that the exchange actually opened, when people were thinking about Black-Scholes, it sucked ass. Like it didn't work. It failed by 30 to 40%. It was completely inaccurate. It was a horrible pricing model. And then by 15 years later, the fit had become so precise that Black-Scholes options pricing was declared the most successful theory, not only in finance, but in all of economics. And so like horrible pricing model, 15 years later, the most accurate pricing model possible. And it literally manifested that into happening.
So how did this happen? Donald Mackenzie introduces the concept of Barnesian performativity, a concept that is named after a philosopher, Barry Burns. And this sounds a bit tautological, if you want, but I'm gonna read it to you. We can read it a couple of times. The idea with Barnesian performativity, the practical use of an aspect of economics that makes economic processes more like the depiction by economics. So the idea that by describing the possibility of an economic process, it becomes real. You may have come across this also if you've had time to look at the texts that we shared by Elena Esposito, some of the readings that are also quite, interesting and influential to us. Now, the key argument here is that Black-Scholes and Merton did not describe an already existing world. The historical evidence is unambiguous. Early tests against, we're thinking here 1966 to 1969 data. Remember that this was published in 1973. What these tests saw is systematic mispricings. And on the CBOE's first day, when we saw that horrible 30 to 40% spread in performance, Matthew Gladstein, who was, I think, the head of the US investment bank, Donaldson, Lufkin, and Jen Red, he actually called Myron Scholes, in panic, declaring, your model is a joke. Okay? And then, as Marek was pointing out, by the mid-80s, the fit had become extraordinary. So we have, tests that were run by Mark Rubenstein using nearly all of Chicago's board options, price quotations and transactions between August 76 and August 77. They found typical deviations of only around 2%, which ultimately went down to 1%. The model didn't change. Nothing changed, but the markets actually conformed precisely to the theory's central assumption, yes? Within 6 months of the publication of the formula, Texas Instruments produced handheld calculators that were pre-programmed to generate Black-Scholes prices. Fisher Black sold paper sheets with pre-calculated prices that traders carried on the trading floor. These material artifacts transformed the model from academic theory into market infrastructure.
So now we're gonna take a step back here again. And so remember this like early thing that we stated about how arbitrage can have this equilibrating effect, right? Like if you have a bunch of people that recognize that something is priced incorrectly and they start to buy it, then you're gonna have this kind of equilibration of supply and demand, right? And prices will neutralize, right? And at the heart of Black-Scholes is exactly this idea that continuous arbitrage is going to be impossible because the rational actors are immediately going to exploit price deviations, and they're going to create equilibrium through price. And for Black-Scholes is built on the assumption that sustained arbitrage is not possible. And what it does is it articulates a theory of value which subordinates price to pricing, that there exists some absolute price for a thing that is determinable not by its material value. We've long dispensed with that, but by the mechanics of options pricing itself, which determine price in the last instance. So price here is determined by what is here. There's a way to determine price through a formula, essentially, and that's a kind of mechanical relationship.
So the problem is that the Black-Scholes assumes continued trading in frictionless markets with no transaction costs. And that, the no arbitrage assumption, is of course a false assumption. If you're thinking about trajectories, you can remove air as something that modifies the trajectory of something moving through space, but you will have to probably calculate that if you're trying to build an airplane. But the Black-Scholes created a new mechanic called delta hedging. If you trade frequently to maintain neutral positions, you can create continuous demand and supply, which fills price gaps, reduces bid-ask spreads, and approximates the very frictionless market that the module assumes. So the idea here is that the world became more Black-Scholes-like. And that's because participants acted as if it was already a Black-Scholes starting point. Yeah, like the model was kind of depicting a reality. Clearing firms reinforced this dynamic through risk management discipline. They monitored traders' operations and positions using Black-Scholes deltas, and they created incentives to use the model even for skeptics, not out of theoretical conviction, but institutional necessity. And they literally, they codified Black-Scholes into practice.
So I can think about Nick Land and hyperstition here. Like this feels like very much like a hyperstitional thing. And Nick Land is obviously someone so if you don't know hyperstition, it's basically manifestation. It's self-fulfilling prophecies. And Nick Land obviously understands that in capitalist economics is like the most sensitive to hyperstition. And certainly that's the case here. This definitely feels like a case of very literal hyperstition. You have someone generated a model, the model didn't work, and then simply because enough people acted upon it, the model began to work, and the entire market economy changed in the United States. And it's true, like Black-Scholes described a thing that didn't exist and ultimately brought about a thing that didn't exist for a period of time. It's true in its own world. And I think that the thing that we're kind of interested in is that like it's not that it was random. Like it's not that like they just hyperstitioned something random. It couldn't have been arbitrary, but it was just close enough to some kind of fundamental assumptions around market mechanics that it was like hyperstition could work with that kernel and actually make itself real. So Black-Scholes became real. But then it confronted real reality. And this is the brutal moment of Black-Scholes. So you have insurance companies were using Black-Scholes logic to essentially do arbitrage. They understood Black-Scholes logic, and they could construct a kind of meta arbitrage using that logic to synthetically represent a type of put. They're basically doing like a very complex kind of short selling with Black-Scholes logic. And so what they actually did was they started to hedge a very, very, very large amount, 60 to 90 billion in 1987 terms of equity assets in this particularly kind of weird way based on Black-Scholes logic. And so this created a catastrophe. There was like a small decline in the market, and then that triggered selling by portfolio insurance companies, and then that selling created further declines. And then the real problem is when arbitrageurs sold stocks to profit from the resulting futures discount using Black-Scholes logic. And on October 19th, the Dow dropped 22.6% in a single day. It was a 20 plus standard deviation event under Black-Scholes. So Black-Scholes predicted this crash occurring at a likelihood of 1 in 10 to the negative 160. So an absolutely impossible event produced by the leveraging of its own tool against itself in this kind of arbitragey way. So portfolio assurance, who created this entire problem, they were assuming that the market they were assuming the kind of central assumption of Black-Scholes, which is that arbitrage is ultimately going to be self-corrective. They then used Black-Scholes to do arbitrage against that assumption, and that created a huge financial crash. And that financial crash is still happening.
Now, the implied volatility surface, the general way the market prices uncertainty, is literally scarred by the collision between Black-Scholes and the real world. So if you look at before 1987, it was relatively flat. Markets had conformed to the no arbitrage assumption. After the crash of October 19, as Mark was pointing out, the volatility skew spiked upward, and this shift has remained. Yeah. Now, if Black-Scholes were correct, implied volatility should be identical for all options on the same underlying asset with the same expiration, regardless of strike price. Volatility is supposed to be a property of the stock itself, not the option contract. But it's now a distinct property of the option contract as well, which points to the raw separation of value production between the stock and its derivative. This is like a huge confirmation of our thesis today. And this is called the volatility smile, which is a super cruel way to put it. Essentially, after 1987, it became systematically impossible to arbitrage away market inefficiencies. They just got more and more complicated. The entire volatility arbitrage industry exists because the smile, this dark smile, means essentially unlimited surface area. Arbitrageurs now retrace over and over again the shape of the smile, its term structure, its dynamics over time, the relative value between different points on its surface. This structural differential generates ongoing productive activity precisely because it cannot be closed. And here's the strange part to us. I'm starting to lose my voice. It's midnight now here. So here's the strange part. Traders still use Black-Scholes constantly, every day, to calculate the implied volatilities that compose that smile.
So like the TLDR here is that some economists came up with the model. The model didn't work, but enough people adopted it in order to make the model work. At the core assumption of the model is that you can't do arbitrage forever. When people used the model to do arbitrage, the stock market crashed, and it left a indelible scar in the markets themselves, which is now used by traders to do arbitrage even more. So it's like this crazy cascade of abstraction just from the kernel of arbitrage that brings us to the present moment of the stock market, which is just endless micro arbitrage at the highest possible scale. We can't stop thinking about the smile. Like, it's crazy. I love that it's called the smile. There's something very foreboding and evil about it. But that's it. That's where we kind of end up today. And so what we've tracked across these four cases has less to do with like a history of capitalism, but we're really kind of thinking about the smile. We're rethinking about the fact that as soon as you name a price, as soon as you fix some kind of ratio within the world, uh, uh, the complexity between that thing that you fixed and the world itself creates massive economic value. And that's the kernel of everything. If that's the takeaway, if that's a takeaway that you can take from today, that's it. Like, you have in China, you have in Persia, and you have with the cowrie trade. There's like someone makes an arbitrary ratio. Someone decides that something is worth something. They give it a price, and from the coincision between that statement and the complexity of the world around it, a market economy appears out of nowhere and just continues to produce value and produce value and produce value. So that's the ultimate conclusion. I don't know if you guys, you're all younger than me, so you probably don't even know what this is. Do you guys even know what It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia is? Like, I feel so old, but this is one of my favorite episodes where they go to gas stations, they buy a bunch of gas, put it in containers, and they sell it for like a little bit more expensive outside of the gas station. And that's the whole thesis here. Yeah. You want to bring us home, Roberto?
Yeah. So just to, if we go back to that kind of Marxian idea of the M to C to M prime, at the core of what we're trying to describe here is the praxis of M to M prime. Okay? C has disappeared. The idea that capital can produce more of itself without an intermediary position in the form of a commodity. Everything we may call capitalism, the social architecture again of M to C to M prime in an industrial context, makes less and less sense as we interrogate the introversion of capital, its preference for direct translation into M prime. Sorry. Now, over the next few weeks, we will tie this up tighter and tighter as we go. We have 3 amazing sessions coming up. And I think Marek may want to introduce the next one now, and then we can come to an end.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing. I mean, like, I think you get the idea. Hopefully, I think we'll go really close to like the contemporary economy next week. I know a lot of people are interested in software. Next week, we're gonna talk about ServiceNow. We're gonna talk about AWS. We're gonna talk about like all kinds of stuff that are like really kind of immediate and clear. Thanks for letting us kind of produce a lot of initial context here. But like this idea that we're describing is controversial and weird, and I think we'd love to like just spend the next 20 minutes like trying to make sure that you guys understand it for the most part. So like, open for discussion now, talking about software, fold, lift, and drag, and all that kind of stuff from there. But hopefully it's clear, like, everything is built on this idea that like capitalism emerges from this dynamic. From when you like say that something is worth something, and that the amount that thing is worth then confronts the real world. That dynamic is really generative and productive. Yeah, hell yeah. Hey, great, Peggy. You're trading in ETFs. That's amazing. That's what's up. That's the only way to trade. 100%. Um, Maybe can we just open up for some initial questions? I think I'd love
You
to.
can raise your hands,
Yeah.
or just go for it, or use the chat if you want to speak up. But yeah.
Ruzbe, maybe do you want to actually describe what you talked about in the chat? I feel like that would be a good productive starting point.
Oh yeah, sure. Hey, so in Ahmadinejad's 20, like when he came into power, like when he got the presidency at 2005, it was just he had this solution to have a like an official subsidized market for US dollars. So you could pay like 10,000 reals for each dollar, but in the free market, it would be 30,000. So in this kind of official market, you would just present yourself to be, okay, I'm going to buy some product. You give me these subsidized dollars, but there was no kind of, how do you say, bureaucracy to kind of monitor these kind of purchases. So they would just buy it and hold it and sell it in the market and it just in time we are at this point of financial yeah, what do you call it, collapse.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like I mean it's funny that like we're now we're closing the loop here because we started with Persia and we're ending with contemporary or like post Ahmadinejad, Iran.
I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah,
think
I think.
the interesting point is
Sorry.
around the bureaucracy, right? Like the bureaucracy is there for enforcement. We're going to talk about this in the form of drag later,
Yeah.
like the idea of like needing to put together a bureaucracy that keeps these relationships in check. But at the same time, what it does is it creates like a lot more opportunities to do arbitrage, right? Like the more bureaucracy that you have in order to like keep track of, the exchange rate of this or to enforce the exchange rate of this versus this, like the more opportunities you have for people that are these like translation people, these intermediary people to take advantage of that roughness and then start to like collect interest rates, maybe resell those on some secondary market, and then you create a bunch of like weird random jobs that like like the whole point of the job is basically to be like, I just got to make sure that this currency is fixed at this currency in this context. Like it's really productive of a whole kind of like weird ass economy that involves labor, but like labor for what? Like weird, like super, super weird labor. Yeah,
So I think
bureaucracy is surface area. Shout outs, Grayson. Yeah.
I mean what we're trying to introduce here is the we're trying to explain the mechanics, and maybe there's a kind of totalizing we've been told that drive in doing that, but we understand that looking at things from a position that is too historically situated gives you an access point that is relevant, but it's a kind of different way of formalizing how things work. And the idea of, I think what we're trying to do here is you may think, well, this doesn't make sense, or this explains this and that, your own experience, your own vision of how things work. And that's what we're trying to develop together. A sort of mechanism that explains how things work, that you can apply to your own vision, that you can adapt to your own critical standpoint, that you may actually disagree with, which is perfectly fine, of course. You may say, I don't see this clearly. But that's the sort of dialogue that we're trying to start. Sorry, I was going to ask, Julian, I know you've raised the hand, but we have a question from Keke. You want to ask it? Are you still here? On the chat? No, maybe not. Or we can come back to
It's
it
a great
later.
question. I mean, it's a question between like at what point does markup stop being value added pricing and when does it become arbitrage? So at what point
That's right.
does, let's say you're an intermediary between two. Let's think of a good example here. Oh yeah, I saw a meme, like maybe like 20 people sent this to me. There's a great company or like an ironic, totally artificial company rather, who what they wanted to do ultimately was instead of, how if you park, especially in the United States, we don't have any fucking infrastructure at all. So instead you pay a third party intermediary via an app to reserve a parking space, basically, and that they have a contract with the government or whatever to do that thing. So there's like 10 of these different apps across the country. It's annoying as fuck because every time you go to a different city, you have to download a new app. You scan the app at the location, you enter the parking space and whatever, and then you do the thing. And so what this guy proposed was, I'm going to create an app that sits on top of that, where I'm going to like literally put the QR code on top of the sticker for the other QR code. You're going to scan that QR code from my application, and I'm going to handle the routing to the underlying application. So whatever parking system is being used in that city, and I'm just going to collect $1 on top of that, right? Every time, right? That's the idea. So I guess the question is like, yeah, at what point does that is that a value? Is it a situation of value add, or is that a situation of arbitrage? Obviously, that's a situation that looks a lot like arbitrage. It's just exploiting, what someone is willing to pay for parking at a particular location and sitting as a direct, completely non-value added intermediary. But then the question of value becomes like, because like to me, like because pricing is the thing that names value, like it is actually generative. Like it has generated a new commercial exchange, it's generated a new dollar circulating through the market out of nowhere. Like that's pretty incredible. And how is that different from, let's say, when we talk about the software economy next week, between, let's say, a company that sells data analytics and a company that sells data analytics visualization software? Like that data analytics visualization software is going to sit on top of that underlying layer and resell it as a value add. So they're adding some value in the form of visualization to that data analytics software that they're selling. But they're essentially doing the same thing, right? They're repackaging everything underneath it and adding something. That something could be as little as plopping a QR code on top of another QR code, or it could be as complex as building another business that is actually, mobilizing that information to produce something that is valuable. And for us, there's no difference between those activities. Those activities are functionally the same. Those activities are both about creating a condition where price can be generated. That's the
I
ultimate
think
thing, is the generation of price.
they, if anything, it's the same, but you may frame it as different questions, and one would be what, and the other one would be how and why. So I wouldn't think of them as two different things. Sorry, Juliana, you wanted to ask something.
Yeah, I'm interested in your language around the uh topography of a ledger and the complexity of that. But I guess I'm also kind of confused by it, or I would appreciate a bit further clarification around, um, I guess, what are the main components in understanding the topography, how complex or how bumpy or smooth uh, a ledger is, and who are the key play like, yeah, I would appreciate if you guys could break that term
Totally.
down a little bit more.
So we see a ledger as the kind of intermediary between two worlds, right? The ledger is the thing that is the equal sign between them, right? Like X from here is equal to Y in this particular location. And so you can start all the way at the bottom in the kind of like antediluvian period, where theoretically there exists something like barter, but we understand from David Graeber that barter never really existed on its own. It was always mediated by currencies. But let's say first ledger would be something like, I am in this city and in the city next over, and I have some milk. Sorry, I'm in this neighborhood and I have some milk and my neighbor has some rice, and our relationship can be confined to a ledger where these two things are placed into some kind of equivalence, right? Rice and milk. This becomes more complicated when you have a city next door that maybe contains a similar relationship, right? Where the relationship between price and milk in that city and the relationship between rice and milk in this city is variable in some way. So then you have a higher order ledger that's maintaining the relationship between those two differentials, right? At some kind of level. Now imagine that you have the same translation occurring again, right? You have another series of cities or another empire or something like that that also sustains their own ledgers that contain a series of relationships between different commodities at different scales. There's going to be another ledger that contains those relationships and mediates them in some way. And so while each of those ledgers is fundamentally the same in that it's describing a kind of equivalence, what it ultimately contains is a greater and greater amount of assumed volatility from all of the complexity around it. So the more kind of differentials you're describing, the more complex the ledger, basically. The bigger the market, the more things you're plugging together. Tucker smiled and raised his hand. So I feel like Tucker has a related question to this. Otherwise, I'll go to someone else. But the smile is like, yeah, I'm all about smiles today. Yeah.
My smile was actually not because of the question.
Okay, well,
because I
then
was
fuck you. Someone else can go. No, I'm just kidding. Go.
Okay. So I was looking back over the notes that I was making, and I'm like interested in the like close enough kind of that we talked about with the Black-Scholes equation and like hyperstition and stuff. This might be kind of a weird question, but I don't know if we'll have another chance to talk about it. But I was kind of wondering about that like gap of like close enough, and like if that's like exploitable or something you're thinking about, and like what's the like exocapitalism theory have to do with like hyperstition? Does that make sense? It's like, is that something you're thinking about when you're like coming up with models? Yeah.
It's actually super scary. Like, actually, literally, Roberto and I have had like conversations of like, did we introduce a demon into the world? Like, I've had late night conversations with my wife where I've been like, I wonder if this is actually good or bad. Because yeah, to your point, like self-fulfilling prophecies like actually do work, I think, to a certain extent, as long as there exists like some, to your point, like reasonable correlation. But the lesson of Black-Scholes, which is I think a little bit different than the lesson of Nick Land, is that like that gap comes back, that like, and it comes back in a real way. And then like what I think is so beautiful is that when that gap came back, it created not just a small problem, like not like a problem within a day, but it actually like enshrined that gap permanently in market economics for at least the next 50 years. Like it was like it came back with such a vengeance. So I think, like, to your point, like the gap in what we're describing, to the extent that could be leveraged in any hyperstitional way, like I don't want to be at all hubristic about like what it is that we've described. I know people have made money on Exo, but like we're not talking like hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like you could definitely use it to do some prediction. But like I want to know what the gap is, because I do believe, contra Nick Land, that gap comes back, and it comes back in like an architectural way. Yeah. I don't know, Roberto, do you have anything to say to that? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean,
I'm
this is
I'm
probably
manic
not
right now.
related to that, but I guess theory exists, or should exist to the point that it is high prestige in a way. We sometimes get asked that question. We got out of that in Europe a few months ago about the kind of political praxis of what is being articulated here. And the attempt is more at a formalization of a dynamic that can help to develop, to become real, to translate into different ways of understanding things. So in a way, I guess we always engage with theory through the possibility of it developing a sort of performative Barnesian kind of dimension to it. And that's happening to some extent. So that's really cool. Emerson, you had some questions.
I do. Could you actually respond to Carrie's question in the chat first? I'm like,
I think it is reality. I
right,
literally think it's true. I do think it's
right.
true. Like, I mean, we wouldn't have written the book if we didn't think that was like really descriptive. We're certainly sure that we've made mistakes. I mean, we wrote the book in like 6
Sorry,
weeks,
okay.
for what it's worth, but we did spend a long time thinking about it prior to. And if anything, this year, I forget who was it that posted last night. Like someone posted this like incredibly cool economics lady. Fuck, what's her name? Oh yeah, Kyla Scan. Like she's totally worth following on Instagram. She's amazing, Kyla Scan. But like she basically just like posted a video like explaining exocapitalism without reading it, because it's just like true now. But I think it's always been true. Like yeah, sorry. I know we did cover it. Thanks. Emerson, go. What's the real
Yeah,
question?
I just wanted to know if there
My
was any more
man.
complex than that. Okay, so this has been great. And you're totally allowed to tell me that this is just like too far out or getting away from whatever.
You're making me
But
nervous.
um, so everything today, it's like, okay, so I'm totally on board. I'm this is kind of like playing devil's advocate or something like that. But like everything that you've been talking about today, like I don't know, man, it sounds pretty sociogenic to me. Like, or there are like you're really foregrounding those aspects, and you guys have hinted at things like what was it, the dangerous maybe interview where you said something, you guys were talking about like energetics, and you said something about like arbitrage happening on like this like galactic scale and stuff like that, and then obviously there's the crab at the end of the book. But like, could you help me understand, or could you give some examples, flesh out like an example like the crab, or I don't know, for how this would play out without the human driver?
So I think it's like what we're trying to say around the part of the human driver is that like we don't want to decompose this into human social relationships. We want to decompose this into a form. And like that's what, like when we talk about arbitrage, we're talking about price, we're talking about value, we're talking about like kind of formal properties that have to do with representation. And at the core of something that I think we both believe very strongly is that representation, if you think that representation is the core, is a kind of core domain that exclusively belongs to humans, you're probably making a mistake. That seems, I mean, we don't have a lot of proof that that's not a mistake, but that does seem like a mistake to make. And so then the question becomes, can these mechanics exist independently of us? And we do think that's the case. We do think that it's very much the case that anything that is capable of representation, as it confronts the contingencies of the world or ontological difference, is going to potentially reproduce a similar system. And I think the real point when it comes to thinking about this is something that is not strictly sociogenic, is that there's nothing to kind of stop this dynamic from recurring, even if you think you stamp it out, because it does seem like it is written into a deeper level than we think it is. It seems like it's more more of a foundational problem. Not to say that it's natural, because that word to me is like pretty much meaningless, but it seems like it's written into a kind of core problem with how we think about the world around us. That's how we think about it. of course, I'm very happy to admit that there can be objects out there that think otherwise. And yeah, like to your point, Hugh, I think like that's a good one, in that like we think of the speciation, or the way that capitalism kind of reappears throughout history. Like there's an interesting amount of autonomy between the local expressions of capitalism and what we see as these kind of recurring patterns, which do seem to be like meaningfully, like powerfully decoupled from any kind of local expression. And the Marxian reading, of course, is to understand this strictly through social dynamics, which is reasonable. Like, I mean, it's totally reasonable to do so, but we're much more interested in going about it algorithmically. But I'm not, yeah, I mean, like, it's very reasonable. Yeah, sorry, Roberto.
No, please.
No, I mean, like, go.
No, you go, man. Finish.
I mean, I'm like thinking about like A2A dynamics. Like, I don't know, like to the extent that you can say that, what's going on in the kind of agent universe right now, autonomous agent universe, is sociogenic. I mean, if you make the claim that that's sociogenic, then fine. Like then everything is sociogenic. But if you understand to a certain extent that what we have constructed in the form of AI agents is to Hugh's point, something that is technically speciating in its own terms, that has its own kind of constraints that are independent of constraints that we might have. Like, we're in tension with those constraints. Those constraints are built into computation. Those constraints are built into compute. Those constraints are like outside of our social control. And if you think about, and they're self-concretizing and self-constraining as well. Like, if you think about those constraints as independent, and you look at the economy that is being constructed right now in the kind of A to A universe, it's this thing again, because those agents are ultimately availing themselves of the same representational faculties that we are, for sociogenic reasons, but also for non-sociogenic reasons. Sorry.
So, I mean, this boils down to a deeper philosophical question, and I think that would be the starting point, which is the extent to which you're willing to accept the idea there are transcendentals that do not have to engage the possibility of human cognition or the existence of humans. Yes, and this is something we've been discussing with Marek a lot. On computation, as he was pointing out, the research of Beatrice Fazzi is really influential there. Also with language now, with Liv Weatherby, New York University, quite an interesting book that came out last year, worth reading. The questions that are being raised about this. Now, if you agree that it's possible, then you can approach, I think, exocapitalism in one way. If you disagree in principle, then it does become more problematic, because to the extent that you position yourself or the kind of human cognitive mechanism as a starting point, then of course the kind of mechanics of what you're going to be discussing and trying to articulate are gonna be different. So I think there's a deeper kind of starting philosophical assumption there that you may want to disagree with, but that's kind of the core that makes this approach possible, I think. Marek.
The way that I always like to think about it is like, we like to think that we can, if something is sociogenic, then it can theoretically also be socially controlled. Like, there are social mechanisms that we can use to remove capitalism. There are protocols that we can use to remove or rewrite capitalism. And I think what we're trying to say is that capitalism is written. That doesn't mean that it's given. That doesn't mean that it's immutable. That just means that it is on its own terms, right? Yeah. I think like language models 100% are like anything, like I'm so happy that we're moving into a phase philosophically where we're starting to understand that like things don't change just because of human thought. Like, things change. Like, that's and like a great example of this is Kanton Measu's Archifossil, which I trot out over and over again. Like, things have been changing forever. Like, that's just it. Like, things do change. They don't need us to change. They don't need us to exist. We actualize them, maybe in the case of capitalism, but we're just actualizing a thing over and over again. No, don't scare me, Hugh. If Riz is here, go away.
Is Riz here?
Immediately, my blood pressure rose. Real ass dude.
No,
all right. Any other questions? No, I love him. Hannah.
Can you explain one more time with the crash in 1987, how it affected the Black-Scholes model and implied volatility and risk?
You're on mute.
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry. The crash in 1987 was basically a result of a certain type of practice that occurred using Black-Scholes. So Black-Scholes was understood not just as a model for predicting price, but it became turned into a technology where if black holes is true, then we can do certain things based on the assumptions in Black-Scholes. And what was ultimately constructed was a certain type of technology called delta hedging, where they were basically like taking the assumptions that Black-Scholes is true. And one of the core assumptions of Black-Scholes is that arbitrage leads to corrections in the market, that volatility is independent of an individual options, that if you go and look at the aggregate kind of curve of volatility within a market, it's always going to be consistent in some way. There's not things that are more or less kind of ontologically volatile than other things. Volatility is actually dependent upon things that are related to the asset itself, to the option itself. So arbitrage in this sense is not possible. It leads to price corrections. And so like they built a kind of technology based on the assumption that that this is true, that the Black-Scholes world is true, this technology delta hedging, and then they started to apply it at a serious level of scale. And what happened was that the practice confronted the raw reality that you can actually do arbitrage, that actually like there exists roughnesses and all kinds of asymmetries within the market. And once that happened, the underlying assumption behind delta hedging was proven to not be true. And then the market collapsed. And in so doing, that kind of codified in the record that this assumption is false, in that it is always possible to conduct arbitrage, that arbitrage will never ultimately lead to permanent price correction because, again, to what we're speaking about, there always exists such sufficient differentiation within the world. And to us, this goes all the way down to something that's almost ontological. So like to me, like I read the smile as a philosophical statement that like there will always exist this kind of powerful, beautiful tension between the way that we represent something and the way that it actually exists within the world. Hopefully that explains it. Yeah. Oh man,
Okay.
Hugh posts the most like let's think about core Reza words: fatty, overinflation, inflation, theological, human. There you go.
Humanism. It's possessed.
All right. Who else has got a question? I love talking with you guys. This is actually, we should just do this.
We're going to
maybe
do a
that's
lot
what
of
we should
this
do. Yeah.
over the coming few weeks. But I mean, it was amazing to have all of you here today, actually, because I mean, the richness of the cohort is like
It's amazing.
It's amazing. It's incredible. And we
really didn't know what to expect, so we like we'll make sure that future lectures are like molded to this particular cohort in a nice way.
Yeah, my brain is starting to melt right now, but I can still speak. Enrique, please.
Yay! Sorry. I was very slow jumping in, thinking with the question because perhaps my problem is a little bit, because I'm more into the grounds of design, so I think a lot about use. I was also following the work you did about interfaces at some point. I think it was early Choreomata, you had an open call and stuff. I'm thinking maybe what would be, this is more of a comment than a question, more like a recommendation is, okay, now I'm going to go about in my life for the next week before I come to the next session. What things can I attune myself to around me so I understand better the concept of arbitrage and the idea of price being the ontologically fundamental question and then give raises to value? Like, do you have any recommendations of how to...
100%.
Yeah, nice.
I have actually something that'll
nice.
perfectly set you up for next week. If you're in the design world and you use any software to do any kind of design, ask yourself why that software is the amount of money that it is. Like that's the ultimate.
The amount of the amount
of money that it is. Ask yourself, why does this software cost this much? Like, how is that price generated?
Totally random. Yeah.
It's fucking random as shit.
Why is 200? Why is 200 euros the subscription of OpenAI and the cloud and all that stuff? Why is it $200? It has no fucking sense.
It's literally random.
Thanks.
Yeah. But that's ultimately
we're gonna
like
talk
start
about
to
that,
ask
actually.
yourself. Yeah. I mean, but ask yourself that question generally outside of software too, because that's where things start to get really interesting. I think that's where I'd start. I would also like truly like everyone here should make a trade. Like if you've never made a trade in your life, everyone here should make a trade. Like
Can I get in trouble here?
no, I just think like
being
it
recorded.
changes you. It's like shooting a gun for the first time. Like you're like,
Oh,
oh,
come
that's
on,
what this
Mark.
is. Like
Yeah.
it no, because it's like you have the simultaneous experience of this is worse than I thought, and this is not as bad as I thought. You know what I mean? In the same sense. But
yeah, but then can you guide me a little bit into the shooting the trading gun for the first time? Because I did something similar when some of my students wanted to do a project about Bitcoin. Of course, I had to go and get some just to understand the situation. So when you're saying trading, you mean to trade in what kind of platform, market, what kind of asset? Yeah. And then I shut up. Thank you.
No, that's a great question. I mean, I personally, I think the easiest thing that you could possibly do would be, who was it that says that their market advisor is helping them get into ETFs? Like, totally, like just buy like a little bit of an ETF. That seems like yeah, thank you. It's you, Peggy. Amazing. Like that seems like a very reasonable thing to do. Someone also mentioned like if you play any kind of like video game, like just buy some like weird thing on in a video game market and try and resell it in some other context. Buy a Pokemon card and try and like that's also something like worth doing, but like complete the trade. But ultimately, like to me, if you want to experience the humiliation and the deflation of the fatty human or fatty humanism, as Reza would put it, buy like a little bit of crypto and just buy some Bitcoin right now. Then you'll lose money immediately and you'll feel the pain. Like that's a good thing to do. Yeah. But I think I mean, like just experience what it feels like to buy something and watch the value of it change without you being able to control it. Yeah.
We can talk about art.
Oh my God, Anna, that's the best comment I have gotten all day. Yeah.
I mean, one thing that you can do, I mean, one idea to take maybe from this is to over the next week I'm sure everyone is doing this already, but not stop thinking about things and commodities and so on, and start thinking about differentials, and what sort of relationships are emerging there and why.
Yeah.
Because it's just a kind of slightly different mindset if you want. And next week we're gonna come back with some of the key ideas that we developed in the book. We're gonna talk about software economy and the idea of fold. So I think differentials is a thing to try to explore this week maybe, and how abstract and ungrounded value generation sometimes may seem. So
Peggy had a question, I think.
Oh, okay. Peggy, you want to ask it, or is it on the chat?
No, I didn't really have a question. I was going to say that I really, I actually have insurance that we have that we take out against the market on my EFTs. So we bet on whether they're going to go up for the quarter or if they're going to go down for the quarter. So I mean, it's sort of crazy, but I think the idea that I don't get impatient anymore. I've had times where I thought that everything was gone and I should have taken a trip around the world, and, instead, and it returns.
Absolutely.
Somehow.
To your point, we're going to talk in 2 weeks around how Meta buys electricity, which is that they don't buy electricity. They buy a future price of electricity from a renewable energy provider. They get a carbon credit kind of like thing in return that they can resell. And then if the price of energy is greater or lesser than what they've committed to, they just have to settle up essentially with the energy provider. That's it. They don't buy electricity. They buy futures contracts with electricity. It's crazy. Same you can talk about a lot with oil and transportation.
Can't wait.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
All right. Anything else, you guys?
Well,
this is so sick.
Is there any other question? I mean, we'll have questions next week as well.
Any feedback? Like, how can we make this better for the group? I know that this was like pretty abstract. We're going to do like a lot of case studies next week. But I don't know if you guys like case studies, if you guys like the philosophy, the case studies, I don't know, more diagrams maybe. I don't know. That would be helpful. Lucy, you got a question? You're muted, my friend. I'm so sorry. You just muted. Okay.
Sorry, I double pressed. So I really struggle with all this, and I have a very, very basic question that I was just fantasizing about, which is so in relation to, when we're kids and how we understand numbers and how we understand quantities in relation to value. And I was just wondering if, like, in a distant future, or the way we understand one or a billion might transform in relation to all of this, because it seems like value and, or the shifting understanding of what a quantity is. I don't know. Anyway, it's just a very basic question, but
100%. I mean, like,
Yeah.
I was thinking about, there was a meme that was pretty good. I'm trying to remember what it was exactly, but it was no, it wasn't a meme. Actually, the guy, the second in command at Kalshi, I think, said this directly. So Kalshi is like a betting app, like Polymarket. It's a place that you, instead of buying stocks, you buy like a bet. So will Russia invade this particular city in Ukraine this week? You can take a position out on that, right? Like, it's like super grim. But the argument that they made was like, that is going to replace transactions. That, like, in 100 years or something like that, the idea of a quantity, as he put it, is going to be variable in this sense, such that you will not buy a mango. I think that's the example that he used. You'll instead place a bet on the price of the mango. And if you'll place a bet not on the price of the mango, but on whether or not someone will bring you a mango at this particular price. And then, like, people who bet against or for can engage in the economic operation of bringing you a mango, right? Like, that's the kind of way that that'll work. So yeah, I do think that's something, yeah. I don't know if that's going to happen at the level of numbers per se, but certainly at the level of, like, imagining what a transaction feels like, I can imagine that and already that is kind of what money is, like, in this kind of roundabout way. But it's just going to become more clear, I think.
Okay.
Okay, Roberto needs to go to sleep. It's, what is it? Almost 1 o'clock for you?
1 a.m. Yes, but I'm still,
yeah.
I do have to work tomorrow again, though. Sunday.
Sucks. Damn.
Yeah.
Well,
You can reach out with
call it.
questions as well. If you want to
reach
email
out.
us at any point. I think we have a
Can someone
Discord,
help
but
us
I
get in the
haven't.
Discord? Yeah.
We
checked
have
that.
we have a Discord channel. I will send the link to everyone via
Okay,
email after the
sweet.
session.
We'll see you in the Discord.
But yeah, I mean, we like try to ask questions. Like we need to engage with as many people as possible, and questions are always ways of finding different ways of framing things and so on. So don't be shy. My voice is failing now, but yeah, I hope that at least this was exciting enough to keep you kind of thinking about some of the core ideas until next week. That's also probably good, because then you probably have questions that are more kind of properly cooked, and you can really challenge maybe some of the stuff we've been discussing and so on. But yeah.
Thanks so much.
You.
It's been great.
Thank you.
Awesome. Next week's gonna be crazy. I think it's gonna be really
Yes.
crazy. I'm really excited. I think, like, people are interested in the software stuff, so we're gonna go deep.
Next lecture is
we're talking about service now. It's so funny. It's crazy. Like, what it is like, it's crazy. It's like impossible to understand. And we'll also talk about agents a little bit too, like how AI agents are changing everything economically. Sweet. Much love. This was awesome.
Nice.
Thank you.